All right, so this is the grouping method for factoring. That's the idea of what we're doing here. Factoring a trinomial, 3 terms, when the leading coefficient is not 1. Okay, so when the leading coefficient was 1, we would find 2 numbers that make C by multiplying and by addition to make B. In other words, 2 numbers that multiply to give me C and add to give me B, and then I just put them in parentheses with the X and I'm done. This is a little bit more extensive. Okay, so first off, this, I'm just putting this here so that you have it as you go through and try some different problems. These are like your directions. Okay, so you can read those as you go. All right, and you can come back to this on your video. Let me give you an example. Let me do a couple of examples for you. Okay, first example. Need a better marker. All right, this is directly from your homework. I don't know if it's one of the problems you're supposed to do, but it's directly from the assignment. So from the 2-2 page. 2x squared plus 9x plus 10. Okay, so this can't be done the way the other one was, where it was just find 2 numbers that multiply to give me 10 and add to give me 9 and then put it in parentheses with the x's. Okay, this one we have to take into account the fact that there's a 2 out front. So the first step on that thing you just saw was multiply a times c. This is your a. This is ax squared plus bx plus c. So you're multiplying 2 times 10, and that gives me 20. Okay? Now, instead of finding 2 numbers that multiply to get 10, I find 2 numbers that multiply to get that. So find 2 numbers that multiply to give you 20, and the other part is the same. They have to add to give you 9. Okay, so it still adds to give you the middle number, but this time they multiply to give you that a times c. So find 2 numbers that have ac as their product, but add to make b. Okay? So when I found those 2 numbers, I found them, and they are 4 and 5. Okay, now the next step says split up the bx, in other words, this whole middle term, into those 2 numbers. In other words, instead of 9x, I'm going to rewrite this so that I have 2 terms, and they're based on these 2 numbers. 9x becomes 4x plus 5x. Okay, so I split up the middle term only using those 2 numbers. 9 is 4 plus 5, so I did 9x becomes 4x plus 5x. The reason I'm doing that, and I can bring down everything else, is that I needed 4 terms. And in the directions, you'll notice it says you now have 4 terms. Okay? So I needed 4 terms, and now comes the part that's called grouping. It's called grouping because I grouped them into pairs. This is why it's called grouping. Okay, so I now have 2 terms here, 2 terms here. Step 5 says take a GCF out of each pair. So I'm taking the greatest common factor out of each pair. So over here I look and I see what's the biggest thing that goes into 2x squared and into 4x. That includes a number and or a variable. So the biggest thing that goes into 2 and 4 is 2. And the biggest thing that goes into x squared and x is x. So I'm pulling it out front, almost like I'm doing reverse distributive property. I'm pulling that out front. So 2x times x makes x squared. 2x times 2 would make 4x. And then over here, the biggest common factor of 5x and 10 is 5. So I pull a 5 out front. And that leaves me with x here, because 5 times x makes 5x. And 2 here, because 5 times 2 makes 10. Now this is not in the directions, but every single time when you get to this point, you should have the exact same thing in these 2 different sets of parentheses. If you don't have the exact same thing in the 2 sets of parentheses, then you probably did something wrong in the last step. Because it's like absolutely essential that you have the same thing in both pairs. Okay, now you're actually ready to write your final answer. But you have to know where it's going to come from. Just like before, you're going to have 2 sets of parentheses. One of the sets of parentheses comes from the stuff that's already in parentheses. You just write it once. So x plus 2 was already in parentheses, so I write x plus 2. Then it's almost like you've canceled that out. Everything else that was not in parentheses before will go in the other set in order. So 2x plus 5. We would usually write the 2x plus 5 first, but it's the same thing either way. I don't think you'd get in trouble if you wrote it this way. But that's your answer. And remember, you can FOIL to check. Okay, so let me give you another example. Let's say I have, and this is from your homework too, so 6n squared, I don't know that it's an actual homework problem, but it's from the assignment, minus 11n minus 10. So again, because there's a number in front of the n squared, we know we can't just do two numbers that multiply to give me negative 10 and add to give me 11, or a negative 11. I have to do the multiplication step first. Remember that first step, multiply a times c. So I'm going to multiply this 6 times negative 10. 6 times, excuse me, I wrote negative 6. 6 times negative 10 is negative 60. And I'm going to find two numbers that multiply to give me that, and add to give me that middle term, which is negative 11. Okay, so two numbers that multiply to give me negative 60 and add to give me negative 11. Those aren't coming to me at the top of my head. Oh, here we go. Positive 15, excuse me, it's 15 and 4. It's negative 15 and positive 4. So negative 15, positive 4. And then remember step 3 says split up the bx, which basically just is another way of saying the middle term. Split up the middle term into those two numbers so that it'll have 4 terms. So the negative 11n, I'm using this term and this term. So it's basically like I'm putting an n on each one of them. Becomes negative 15n plus 4n. It didn't happen this time, but if you got a negative in the very center here, you're going to want to move that over. Like if you got a minus here, I would write plus negative. And here's why. Let's go ahead and bring down everything else. I'll show you why. Remember, you wanted 4 terms. And we have 4 terms now. And the next thing you do is you group them in pairs. When you do that, you don't want a minus in the middle. You want a plus in the middle. So if this had been a minus, I would stick it inside of the parentheses with the negative 4. Okay, so now I take out my greatest common factor. The greatest common factor of 6n squared and 15n is 3n, and that goes 2n times minus 5, because 3n times 2n is 6n squared. 3n times negative 5 is negative 15n. Now notice, and this isn't going to happen this time, but sometimes you have to think about what you're going to pull out of this one because it has to match this. So really, you're pulling a greatest common factor out of the first one, and the second one, it's more like you're pulling out whatever will make it match this inside. But in this case, that's a greatest common factor. If I take a 2 out of both of these, that leaves me with 2n minus 5. Sometimes you might have to take a negative number out of the back one so that the signs will match exactly in these 2 sets of parentheses, because that's your goal. And now you're ready to write the answer. One set of parentheses comes from the stuff that's already in parentheses, which is 2n minus 5. The other set of parentheses comes from everything that's outside of the parentheses right now, which is 3n plus 2. And there's your answer. The end.